delighted that you could join us this morning. Unfortunately, I think many of you will have registered expecting to see Colin King chairing this session, but unfortunately Colin can't join us this morning, so I'm standing in for him. Clearly I'm not going to be as good as Colin, but I'm sure I can field questions and introduce our speakers to you, and it's our speakers who are going to be providing you with lots of lovely details around PAS 2035 this morning. So if we could just flick on please to the next slide, I'll describe to you very quickly what we're going to do this morning. So we've got 3 speakers this morning and an opportunity for questions. And our 3 speakers are Kerry Mashford, and I'm delighted that Kerry can join us. And Kerry is going to talk us through the new Building Performance Evaluation Standard. And the majority of our time will be spent there this morning, listening to what Kerry has to tell us. If you would please save your questions for the end or pop them into the chat. What we will do is we'll get to them at the end of Kerry's presentation. If we can't get round to them all, we commit to, as usual, picking them up offline and making sure that we get back to you. We'll then have a quick break, and then after the break, Alan Pither is going to talk to us about the latest updates on PAS 2035, the relatively minor ones, and also just spend a little bit of time thinking about retrofit assessment and retrofit advice and the general direction of travel that we might be seeing there. And then finally, Arn will pick us up on the next summit. And we are going to start planning our next summit as soon as we finish this one around preparing for great delivery. And that's based on some of the work that we've done and the comments that we've had from members and people we're speaking to in the industry, that some more support and help would be appreciated. So Arn will pick that up at the end of the session. There's already a question, where will the recording be? The recording is going to be posted onto the YouTube channel that you can get in your members area through your login. And there will obviously be lots of activity on LinkedIn afterwards, so we'll remind people where they can get the recording also. Okay, and with that, thank you very much. I hope that you find the presentations thought-provoking and provide us with lots of questions afterwards. Okay, Kerry, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Sally. I'll just try and move this on. Good morning, everyone. It's all gone blank. Hang on. Right. Oh dear, it's got some animations that I hadn't realised. Excellent. There we go. Not to worry. We'll manage this. Okay, so I'm Kerry Mashford, and I've been chairing and co-authoring this new British standard on building performance evaluation. Critically, this standard is about the evaluation of buildings in use and based on actual measured data, observations and user experience. So there are standards, international standards already that work on the basis of theoretical performance, but this is the first one that really focuses in on how buildings actually perform. At the bottom here of this, I've just put a link to purchase the standard, so you can follow that one up with BSI if it's if you wish. And I know the Building Performance Network did have some sort of free issue versions for their members. So if you're interested in joining the Building Performance Network, they may well still, or at least contacting them, they may well still have some available if you're able to join as an individual member or a group member. So anyway, this is me. I have a background in building performance evaluation. Just to explain to people a little bit, I ran the building performance evaluation programme for the Technology Strategy Board, as it was, Innovate UK, around 2009 to 2012-13, and following that, that was really where we really revealed some of the performance gap issues. And following that, I went on to run the National Energy Foundation, where we tried to do an awful lot to develop new tools and techniques that would help improve the speed and accessibility of building performance evaluation techniques, and also to really bang the drum about the fact that the predicted performance is often way different to the actual performance of a building, and we really need to be working on the basis of the actual performance to give us that information that we need to direct our actions. So if I move on to this next one, the reason we need to do building performance evaluation really is to compare the actual performance versus the theoretical performance in many cases. And as I've said, unless we really know what's happening, we can't decide what to do about it and how to address any discrepancies. Increasingly important is the context of climate change. We need to go to net zero. We need the energy systems transition in this country and across the world. And if we are basing this all on predicted performance, which in turn is based on a lot of assumptions, we really are deluding ourselves as how well we're doing with this. We need to properly get to grips with this. So the opportunities and the demand really by the climate change crisis has really exacerbated our need for building performance evaluation. Also, things like COVID. Health and well-being is now becoming increasingly important. That's another element of building performance evaluation. And some of you who've been aware of the history of PAS 2035 and the Retrofit Standards task group that was set up off the back of Each Home Counts will know that the well-being of people and the well-being of the buildings, the fabric of the buildings, are all very critical elements, and understanding what is actually delivered in the context of those is critically important. Building performance evaluation plays in there. And closing this loop to improve the new build and building upgrades, to feed that back into what we need to do differently. And increasingly, in order to actually make things happen, particularly on retrofit, we need to have a way to finance these things. People need financing, whether it's a public sector finance or whether it's private finance. There are requirements really to find and access finance, which in turn really relate to the improvement that you're going to achieve by that financed upgrade. And therefore, we need to have a basis for reporting performance contracting on and pay as you save and so on that. So that's another reason for doing building performance evaluation, that actually you can use that to support your financial decision making. So the standards needed for consistency in key parameters. Make sure that we're actually evaluating the same things, and there's a minimum standard or minimum set of things that we're evaluating that comprise a valid and appropriate evaluation. We need to be able to have the same ways of doing things and doing the evaluation in different projects. There's been over the last 10-15 years, performance evaluation has grown. The things that people have done have become better embedded, but there is inconsistency, and consequently there is you often find people are comparing apples and pears, or they're arguing about how an evaluation was done rather than what that has has revealed. And so we need to make sure that we've got a consistent way of doing things, that we can therefore, on the back of that, provide a basis for compliance reporting and contractual verification, which ties into the finance side that I mentioned previously. And also we want to provide a standardized performance evaluation that can be used by other standards. And this is again a bit of a chicken and egg situation, but PAS 2035, as it was initially conceived and developed, has an evaluation element, and the evaluation stage was always due to be replaced by a more comprehensive standard that could be called from PAS 2035. And what we're trying to do now is, rather than making the standard, or what we have done, is rather than making the standard BS40101 applicable only to retrofit, we've made a comprehensively compatible standard across all building types, all stages of a building life after it's gone into use. So let's move this on. So the applicability of BS401 is for all types and uses of buildings, and it can also be used for individual buildings, for cohorts of buildings. So if you've got a group of buildings that either form a community, or you've got a program of upgrades, for example, across similar buildings, that can be grouped together as a cohort. And also what we've described as base buildings. That's a term more commonly known in non-domestic spheres, but a base building is essentially a building that has individual premises within it. So it might be a shopping centre, for example, it might be an innovation park, it might be a block of flats. So it has common services, but each individual premises or dwelling within it will have its own metering as well. So it's possible then to look at the base building as separate to the individual premises within it. The standards can be used at any point in the life cycle of a building, in the in-use phase rather of that building. So it can be used before and after retrofit. It can be used fairly soon after a new building has been completed to try and evaluate and assess that. It can be used to look at a building that is going to be marketed for rent or for sale, and therefore, hopefully finding out and eventually using it as a plus point, the good performance of that building. It's based on the actual in-use data of a building, and I'll come on to more about that in a moment or two. And the basis of evaluation is not a rating scheme itself. So you don't say what good looks like in BS40101. There is no independent assessment or independently set baseline that you use in 40101. And that helps it be usable in a wide variety of situations. So you need to have a context relevant comparator case. And that sounds very general and a bit wishy-washy maybe, but by giving you a few examples, I hope I'll make that clearer. So in the case of a relatively new building, you would have the design specification of that building. And that would be a default comparator case that you would use definitely if it was a fairly new building and you had access to the design specification. It could also be industry benchmarks. So if you've got buildings that you want to compare, how does your office building compare with similar office buildings? There are some industry benchmarks, and there are increasingly more categories of those. So you might have your own internal benchmarks. If you're, for example, if you're a large social housing provider, you may well have benchmarks across your stock. You might have target performance. So if you've planned an upgrade to a building and you're expecting a certain outcome performance, then that performance will be taken into account. That will form part of your comparator. And you can actually have multiple comparators as well. You could look at the design specification, you could look at industry benchmarks, you could say it's better than this but worse than that in this case, or whatever. You can look at the pre-upgrade performance, so you can evaluate the building, capturing the data prior to an upgrade, and then you can compare afterwards the eventual performance with that pre-upgrade performance. And also you can draw on published data that, for example, World Health Organization data and various other sort of rating schemes and what good looks like for certain performance parameters. And we haven't embedded those in the in the standard directly, because they will be revised and updated at different times. And depending on where you are in the world or in the country, or even in the different devolved authorities in the UK, you might reference different data sets, but you can use those to develop your comparator. And the key thing here is to define your comparator before you start doing your evaluation. So at least have some good sense of that. You can always add more, but that's really what you want to be knowing right at the outset. What are you trying to achieve, and therefore what are you comparing against? So what BS40101 does is to start right at the planning stage of a BPE project, and that could be either as a standalone project or within a construction project. If you're starting a new build, you really want to have your evaluation project planned alongside that, so that you can embed sensors. You can make sure, for example, that if you've got renewable energy systems, that they have the right metering associated with them, and you can capture that data right from the outset. And that makes it much obviously less expensive to do it that way, and more appropriate for what you need to achieve. There are three types of, or three levels really, of BPE project, and I'll come on to that again in more detail. There's a preliminary evaluation, a standard evaluation, and then there are investigative techniques which can be added to any or all of those. I'll come on to that. We've talked about the comparators, so it covers the selection of comparators, how you go about that. It also covers the how you go about gathering the data, how that data should be tagged, named and retained, so that again there is an opportunity, if you wish, or if there's some other purpose for bringing data together from across multiple sources. That could be for research purposes. It could be if the for example, if one social housing provider transfers a block of stock to another one, then that data then remains consistent and compatible over time. Also, we have made that quite high level, because again, we don't want to be putting people off who have already gone part way down that track and have got their data in some way or other. So there may be, we're trying to take people with us on this, and address all of those, right from the people who've done nothing at all so far to those that have got quite well developed programs of evaluation. It then goes into how you carry out the individual study elements, the essential ones that relate to each of the three basic levels, preliminary, light and standard, and the optional ones that relate to the investigative toolbox. It covers how you, or the fact that you need to look at the parameter by parameter performance comparison, but also that you need to really look at this in the round. And this is where the real skill of the evaluator comes in, that you're not looking at an individual parameter. That will give you the discrepancy if there is any, but it won't really give you the why or the how. You really need to look at multiple parameters in the round to try and develop hypotheses, and then see if your data backs those up. And that then potentially leads to more investigative BPE, depending on what your objectives of the study are. And then it also covers how you report your results and claim compliance. Finally, in the standard, we've got a little bit of informative, well, we've got a lot of informative guidance, and we've got 3 example use cases, including the use of light BPE on a cohort of upgraded buildings, so upgraded dwellings, in fact. So I think that's the one is the most relevant to past 2035. Just as there's so many on the call, I think probably some of you will have been aware of the consultation process that happens with all British standards and may have contributed to that. You may still have in your mind the previous draft that we released for public consultation. So I just wanted to spend a moment or two on what changes resulted from that, because we did listen to an awful lot of great feedback, and I want to thank anyone who provided that for their contribution. We had obviously we had contradictory feedback, so that's you won't see everything in here that you asked for, but this is what we've done as a consequence of that. So prior in the first issue for public consultation, we had a separate early occupation evaluation from the in-use evaluation. We merged those and made it all one, and because we've made it slightly more general, that's worked as well. We've got greater flexibility regarding the depth of the evaluation. Previously, we didn't have 3 levels. We now have the 3 levels. We've introduced the base building that I described earlier on. In the case of a cohort of buildings, we had a rather complex proposal for deciding what proportion of the buildings you should evaluate at some level of depth and what at a much lighter level of depth. Now we've simplified that sampling so that it's really just a minimum of 10% of the buildings on the cohort need to be studied at a slightly deeper depth. There's an ability to tailor the investigative elements to suit the objectives of the project. So there is a bit of people ask for some people ask for a very flexible pick and mix of the evaluation, but we did feel that would allow people to focus just on 1 parameter or 2 parameters, and that wasn't, we did need this evaluation in the round. That wouldn't be satisfactory. So we've reduced the number of essential elements and provided more flexibility on the optional elements. We've got no numerical values of merit. I've described that, so we don't say what good looks like. We had previously been asked to introduce things on air quality from World Health Organization results and other sources, but now there's a separate British standard, BS40101 which is looking at indoor environmental quality, and that's now taken that material into that standard. And we've incorporated an investigative toolkit. The investigative toolkit also gives us great opportunities to allow for new tools to come in. We very much don't want this to be a static set of tools, and for new tools, great tools that are being developed, not to be able to be used in this with this standard as soon as they've reached a certain level of validity. We absolutely want to be able to bring those in, because it's only by having new, quick and easy tools that people can use that we can really get this embedded in practice. So that's what we've done following the consultation. So, that looks a bit large. Oh, hang on, right. I hope you can see that. I'm just going to move. I've got a panel above my screen, so I'm going to move that off. I'd hope you can see the bottom of this, because I can't at the moment. But anyway, this is just the way you go about constructing a project. Once you've appointed an evaluator, together with an evaluator, they or you as a client would select the evaluation level that you want to follow, and this is just an indication here of the sort of level of detail associated with the individual or sample buildings, with all buildings in a cohort with a base building, and you can see that sort of goes up slightly as we go along there, and then you can add into those investigative elements, which you can add in right at the outset depending on the scope of your study. So if for example, if you're in an area where there's a very busy road, you might want to add some additional things on indoor air quality compared to external quality, on acoustics. You might want to add to any of these at a greater depth than might be there in the initial, the basic standard, the basic level 1. So you can add those in, or you can do an investigative BPE project following on from any of these. So if you reveal something through this and you want to dig deeper, you can go on to do an investigative BPE project. So you can use that in either circumstance. So every level includes something about the basic building parameters, the occupant user experience, what is often called a post-construction review, but I'll show you that in a minute. It's at any point post-construction, so it's just kind of a building review really. Energy use and generation, water use, internal condition monitoring, external condition monitoring, and building fabric performance. And here are some of the tools and techniques that are used, and there's a kind of the survey techniques here. There's this is indicating a walkthrough, which is not quite a walkthrough, but definitely, human beings. The buildings are for people predominantly, and so we need to get the input and the experience of individuals in as great great instruments to tell us how the building's performing. Oops, hang on, gone back one. Right. So here's what's included in each of those things. I won't go through it in detail, but building parameters, most of these parameters are things that are already captured by a straightforward assessment of a building at the outset, or are available from the specification. Then there's occupant and user experience. There's survey techniques, and if the building has a buildings or facilities manager, or some person looking after the base building or the cohort of buildings, then having their view as well is very important. In the post-construction review, we include air permeability tests, either a review of one that's recently been done, or to conduct one ideally, if not. Review of a lot of processes and documentation there. Then there's a building walkthrough, either with the occupants, potentially also with the designers if they're still around, and with the building managers if that's appropriate. A controls review, so you can see what controls are available and how they can be used. Thermal imaging survey in the case, in some cases in winter ideally. And then annual meter readings, consumption and generation monitoring at a lower level of granularity or finer level of granularity in some of the standards, some of the levels. Annual meter readings for water and internal temperature and relative humidity, carbon dioxide. At the bottom of this, I should say external monitoring. It seems to have dropped off the bottom. The external monitoring is usually taken from external weather stations that are already that are close enough by. If you do have a sort of a very either a large building or something that is on a part of a cohort in a particular geography, it's well worth putting up a particular dedicated little set of sensors, and this goes into how you can do that as well. So on the three levels there, this is really just to give you a bit of an indication where the crosses are. Preliminary evaluation really only covers the basic building parameters, survey material, survey work, post-construction review, basic energy use and generation, and the basic external condition monitoring. So that is really just getting a little bit of a sense of how the building, how much energy and other resources the building uses, and what the people think about it. It's very, 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 very light. And in fact, we had big debates about whether it should be in there at all, because it's really just a stepping stone to bring people into thinking about closing the loop on their building performance. There's very little, there's no internal temperature monitoring or internal environmental monitoring involved in this at all, although we strongly sort of advise that the lightest one you really should be doing is light. But sometimes you can go back to the preliminary one retrospectively. So if you haven't got data, so you're starting on a retrofit project, you won't necessarily have this data, or if you won't be able to capture it for a year. You might, in terms of, for example, internal condition monitoring, you might be able to capture a few weeks of it. So basically, you can use this as a bit of a baselining to get that set up. Light BPE, you can see there are more crosses in more things, and standard BPE even more. Again, that's dropped off the bottom of my screen. I hope it's not on yours. So you can see that here we've got on the right hand side the base building. If you're doing a base building only, not looking at the premises within the building, these are the things you need to do, and those relate directly to the base building parameters. If you've got an individual building, you will be doing all of these, or whichever of these is relevant. If you've got a cohort of buildings, on 10% of them, or at least 10% of them, you will be doing this. And on the remaining 90%, or in fact all of the buildings in the cohort, you will be doing levels of surveying and basic meter readings. I can see somebody just asked at the bottom, popped up what the base building was. Just a reminder, base building is a building that has individual units inside it. So it's either a block of flats where you're looking at the shared services and the common areas, or for example, a shopping centre and the like. Okay. And then we've got this goes into more detail, and I'm not going to go through all this now. I'm just going to put this because you'll get these slides, so hopefully you can have a look at this. And these all relate to the sections where the how to do it is described. And the how to do it in some cases references common practice or standards or methods. It's not, we haven't started from first principles on all of this, because it's mostly about using good techniques that are already out there. So this is the one for the preliminary evaluation. It talks about what you need to do for different sort of annual meter readings for 12 months, obviously, potentially consumption and generation monitoring for on 30-minute 12-month intervals, and not selected here, you can see. So only where the crosses are is where they will be selected. So if we move on to the next one, you will see again on the light BPE that's not required, but on the standard BPE it is required. So you can see how the comprehensiveness is increasing as we go through these levels. It doesn't mean you can't do that. If you've got that data available, capture it, but definitely as you go up through the standard, in order to claim compliance with a standard level BPE, you would need to be doing these things. And then on the investigative BPE, these are some of the other things that you might want to do. Greater level of water use. So you can see flow rate assessment of fixtures. Again, these are things you can just pick if they're relevant for your particular project. A lot more on indoor air quality, internal condition monitoring. You can see all of those things that can be done, and they're all covered in the investigative BPE toolkit. External monitoring, might want to do more parameters that are not included as standard in the basic levels. You might want to do on-site weather station, building performance, the fabric stuff. You might want to look at heat transfer coefficient measurement, maybe using one of the smart HTC type SMETAs type projects solutions now. In situ U value measurement, and there's quite a big section on material moisture measurement and how you could go about doing that. And so now I'm just going to give you what we're up to at the moment. So our key sort of activities really now, the panel that has devised the standard, developed the standard, it still exists. It hasn't disbanded. It's kind of in abeyance at the moment, and we're all keen to promote the uptake of this of all levels of the BPE standard, and to explain to people how and where it can be used. what we're also saying is, in certain circumstances, if people, if organisations are not don't feel ready to jump into one of these particularly, but they are already measuring certain things, or they want to start measuring certain things, look at that individual study element and at least do it in consistency with that. You won't be able to claim the British standard, but you'll be doing things in a way that is for that particular element. At least the data capture is relevant, is compatible. From a standard development point of view, we want to be, obviously the standard's only been out a month or so now. We want to be gathering in-use experience with it. We do have the option for a minor revision of the standard. There's no plans at the moment to do something on an annual basis like PAS 2035 is looking at, but we're looking at least doing a review and revision of in a year or so's time based on that. Also, there was always the intention for this to be provide the evaluation part, or the evaluation aspects that could be referenced from other standards. So PAS 2035, BS40101 various other ones, we're looking at how it links to those, and we'll hopefully be working with the team that's developing PAS, the next, the iterations of PAS 2035 to make sure that it can be appropriately referenced, and if we need to do some tweaks, then that can be part of the minor revision, hopefully. And we're doing our best to show to people how it can be used to fulfill all the requirements I set out in the beginning. So regulatory requirements, finance providers, performance contracting, how major property owners can use this, and how policymakers can use it as well. So that's really where we're at, and so I'm very pleased to take questions and try and also comments, really, and we'll very much want to move on with this really make it use it as a great tool to improve the outcomes of our retrofit. And I'm doing that myself with work with one or two social housing providers. So I'm very keen to, and that's giving me some practical experience in what's easy and what's less easy. So
thank you very much. That's great, Kerry. And we've already got a few questions coming in. I saw that you picked one up when you were talking. There was one came in before that from Abdul. Specifically, what do you do if there are no water meters?
Well, essentially, you have to meter the water. So to actually comply with some of these a level of a standard, if there are circumstances where you'd have to put some kind of metering or monitoring in, it may not be a fiscal meter, but you would need to put some form of monitoring that into the building if it doesn't exist already.
And could that be temporary?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah, it can be for the period of the evaluation. I mean, what's actually been found, and I think it was found with the reported in the SMETA's test results, if anybody's looked at that report, was that it was people who've got monitoring equipment in their homes, on the whole, they don't mind it staying there forever, really, as long as it's not intrusive and it's not flashing lights at them. They're quite happy with that, which was, to some extent, is quite a surprise. And obviously things that stay there for any length of time have got to be recalibrated, so you've got to make sure that things are really still doing their job if you come back a few years later and try and use them again. But yeah, it can be for temporary purposes.
Thank you. And I've got two questions from Kath, actually. The first one, where properties are occupied, how does the standard advise that consumption data is collected where the tenant will be responsible? And her second question, because it's connected, they're working, her organisation is working with somebody, a switchee, on a new development, which should give that level of data, but that's not common data. So responses to those two things, please.
Yeah, just trying to think I haven't got the standard up in front of me at the moment. There is a how people can capture the data and how they need to. I think they just need to declare that they're taking that reading basically on an annual, if they're capturing energy use on a monthly basis, and they're feeding that, reading that meter and sending it in, then that's adequate. You can't pin everything down. So I think that's really the basis of that. Does that answer the first question?
So what you're saying is that the standard will accept that consumption data can be manually collected or recorded via a smart meter and noted, as long as you have evidence. Yes, it doesn't have to be verified by a third party or anything like that.
No, it can. I mean, the best way obviously is to take a photograph if you've got a meter. So you've got that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's great. And the second one was, we are working with Switchy on a new development which should give us this level of data, but not common.
So I'm not 100% sure what she means by common. Whether she means it's publicly available or. Okay,
well, I'll wait for Kath to pop something in the chat. Is it about the data to common parts, Kath, or are you suggesting?
No, what I mean is, I don't believe, certainly looking at our other stock and other, someone else has put that they are retrofitting existing dwellings, but having that level of sort of remote monitoring, as far as I'm aware, is not common practice.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And I totally get what you say about having regular meter readings, but I'm just wondering about the practicality of that. We've just been doing a LADGE project, and it's been quite an effort to get access for retrofit assessments. I mean, we've got them, and but so to get repeated access to check meters on a monthly basis could be quite time consuming, I would imagine. But I guess the better relationship you have with your tenants around the project and they're seeing the benefits, and that might make it easier. But it's not as simple necessarily as just walking in and checking a meter. I don't think. Obviously you've got to arrange that with tenants. Practicality. So
is there a minimum, Kerry, that is acceptable in terms of that engagement with residents? Because I had a question around resident engagement, which seems to fit in with this one that Kath's talking about here, that you need to engage with residents around evaluation to understand how they're feeling about it as well. But is it as simple as a meter reading before and a meter reading afterwards?
I'm just looking at it at the moment, Sally, because the different levels do require, sort of acknowledge that and have different. That's why it's one of the reasons there are different levels, because different levels of access and access to data are likely to be possible in depending on the particular circumstances. So I'm just trying to.
Why don't we take that one offline if you're having to refer to a document, and we'll commit to getting that back out. We'll share that with people later in terms of what is the best practice and minimum. So moving on to a different question, Carl, thank you, Kath. Carl is asking, does PAS 2035 require us to use this British standard, or is it just best practice at present?
As far as I can tell, and probably Owen can explain this later, that at the moment the current version of PAS 2035 has evaluation embedded in it, and at the moment it is not, so it isn't requiring this level or this particular standard to be used. This standard wasn't published at the time that the PAS 2035 was being updated, but I think next iteration it should be calling this standard in some level of this standard anyway.
Okay, so at the moment, best practice not required. Watch out for what the future brings. Okay, thank you. Next question is, will coordinators do evaluations, or is this going to be a separate role, or required now to be a separate role?
I think that's a question for PAS 2035. I can talk about what evaluators how you find a good evaluator and what constitutes a skillful evaluator. And the skills that you might look for if you're looking for an evaluator from a client perspective. But it also says that in the standard that in PAS 2035 and PAS 2038, a qualified retrofit coordinator is considered to be suitably qualified to conduct a performance evaluation. At least that was the case at the time we wrote it. Yep. But that okay, excellent. That qualification on its own doesn't indicate the holder has sufficient knowledge and skills to conduct BPE in accordance with this British standard. So we recognise in this British standard it goes quite a lot deeper in some respects, and depends, not the same level of qualification or competency or experience is needed for each level. So that's something that's subject to the particular needs, really.
Okay, so Alan's nodding and confirming that
yes,
that's correct.
Do you want me to just add a little bit more on that in response to John's question, or we could come back to it later?
No, I think let's finish it here, and then, because we've got a few more questions, but we've got a good 10 minutes.
Okay, it's a point that will come up again anyway, but it is a separate role, but the same person can do more than one role. So it could be and as Kerry just said, at this point in time, retrofit coordinators are qualified to do the evaluation that's required by PAS 2035.
John's come back and said, can you coordinate and evaluate the same project? Does this present a conflict of interest? We'll finish this and then we'll move on to the next question. It does present a conflict of interest, and PAS 2035 requires allows the retrofit coordinator to do what is defined as basic evaluation on the project, but if that basic evaluation identifies any problems or issues, then an independent person who may be another retrofit coordinator in the short term will need to come in and do the intermediate and or advanced evaluation that is required in that case.
And in the British standard, we're not as prescriptive as that, to be honest. We did, this is something that we had in and we've made less prescriptive. We originally intended to have that you recognising that there's some value in people who've been involved, for example, in a new build, in delivering the project, actually then coming back and evaluating it afterwards, because that helps their knowledge increase and so on. So we did allow various three levels, basically: a self-evaluation with independent independent review, and an independent evaluation. Now, because of some of the rules within BSI, you can't have alternatives like that in claiming compliance with the standard. So we have effectively reworded that such that you need, when you can use whoever you are, whoever you want to do your evaluation. It can be part of the project team or not, but you need to recognise that potential conflict of interest, and there's also an issue there with professional indemnity insurance and all kinds of things that got tangled up in that. But as a client, you might want to make sure that your evaluation was done by someone who is, if you need an independent verification, for example, for finance, for a finance provider, then that needs to be taken into account. So there are good reasons for choosing people who know the project and people who don't know the project, and just depending on your context, make sure you're clear that you've got it all covered off. Is really the way we deal with it in the British standard.
Thank you. Next question is from Peter Bates. How do you get to a point where you can say you are monitoring to BS40101 compliance?
I don't. That isn't an actual thing you're supposed to be able to claim in a way. You can. There's no sort of. I guess if you're doing it's the whole evaluation that you claim compliance with. But if you look at the elements of the evaluation and you look at the way the data needs to be collected for each of those, and you can decide that for example, you're going for a standard BPE, then you can very quickly identify how your data needs to be collected, and therefore, you know, of that data, which is monitoring data, then you can say, well, I've therefore, you know, specified my monitoring kit and the approach there, such that it will be compliant with, or it will enable a standard BPE compliance. So it's kind of that way round.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Margaret Reynolds: who is qualified to carry out these analyses? Is there training for consultants or facilities managers or climate change activists? At what level of training is there available, and who can go on it?
Well, there is no dedicated training available. There are various MSCs and all kinds of things that people can do on this. So I'll just read out the section that we've got in the standard, because that's easier than me trying to paraphrase it. And it says the evaluator should be skilled in planning and directing BPE projects and identifying cross correlations amongst performance parameters, knowledgeable in the probable root causes of anomalies in performance, and especially in the case of investigative BPE projects, in developing and testing hypotheses. Evaluators are likely to hold one or more of the following professional registrations, and there's a chartered engineer with various of the engineering institutions identified, a chartered member of the Royal Institute of British Architects, or architects registered by the Architects Registration Board, chartered architectural technologist, professional member of the Chartered Institute of Building, chartered building surveyor, incorporated engineer, or EngTech. So the implication, or the intent there, is that that because there is no dedicated, you know, sort of full degree or whatever to get you to the point of building performance evaluation, and because it also requires quite a bit of experience and analytical thinking to do this properly, and because there are different levels, then you're likely to have some of these qualifications as a start, but that doesn't mean that you can completely be conduct building performance evaluation. If you're, for example, a member of the IStruct, but you may well have gone on from that and then focused on building performance evaluation. Now, I know that the Building Performance Network is targeting a piece of work on how to develop the training and the peer review effectively for a register of evaluators, and they do have are creating a register of evaluators. So it isn't exclusive. It doesn't mean you can't use someone who's not on the register, but the idea is that for people who want to make sure they've got an experienced evaluator, that they could go to that register and find someone. And I think that will sort of happen more quickly. That's happening sort of now-ish, and then very soon we'll start to move on to training for different levels.
Okay, thank you. We've got three or four more questions, and then I'm going to tell people now, if there's any more questions come in the chat after Paul McGrath's, I'm going to say that we'll pick those up later offline so that we can move on with the rest of the session. But if I move on now to Dean Owen's question, which is 3 or 4 questions in one, so get ready for this one, Kerry. How practical is it including a BPE into a retrofit market of existing dwellings on schemes such as LADS, Eco, Hug, etc.? What would the positive impact be to the supply chain, or is this an added layer of work and administration to be carried out?
Well, I'll start with the last one. I mean, yes, it's a kind of an added layer, but you know, what other engineered product or technique or delivery of a solution do you not test at the end? You know, this is a kind of to a certain extent, a cultural thing. We do need to move on to recognise that part of doing a good project, part of doing the work, is to be able to check that that's been done well and has delivered the outcomes. Performance outcomes are extremely difficult to see. You know, a lot of these things are invisible, You can't easily see air quality. You can't easily see heat leaking out of buildings. We need to do some form of evaluation to really understand whether the methods that we're using and the approaches that we're using and frankly the individuals that we're using to do the work are actually delivering the right outcomes. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very keen to have tools developed that enable people to self-check as they're doing things and to improve their own knowledge. So, you know, some of you will come across the pulse air tightness testing technique. That was one of the things that you know, I championed and developed the development of when I was Chief Exec of the National Energy Foundation, because I wanted something that people could use on site and really get to the bottom of and feed that back to people. Nobody wants to do a bad job, but often you haven't got the tools to tell yourself that you're doing a really good job. So I think that, you know, that's the sort of starting point. I accept at the moment that we're in evaluators and the evaluation process is still quite hard to deliver at scale. But unless we start doing it, and in fact that, you know, what's in past 2035 is really fairly light touch. So at the moment we'll just increase all of that, and lots of projects now are being, you know, people are adding this on, not necessarily on the labs projects, although in fact I'm working on one as well, and I'm helping people to do that and to put that into a LADS 2 proposal as well. So I think it will be part of it. People are recognising increasingly now that it's not an optional extra, it's an essential part of what we need to be doing.
Thanks, Kerry. Can I just come back on you that for a moment, if I may? I'm just trying to look at this from a practical point of view, how intrusive this would be for an occupant and how easy it possibly could be with new technology and new devices, and how a BPE, if it doesn't hit, you know, the desired rating, could that possibly affect funding under those different schemes at all, or is this something still in the pipeline to understand? Thank you. I
think at the moment it's really on gathering information. I mean, if you think back to, you know, when Charles Handy did, was it Charles Handy? No, it wasn't Charles Handy. Whoever it was who did the work bit that precursed the each home counts and looked at the external wall insulation stuff. There were no, you know, a lot of the assessments of those, or, you know, visual inspections of those didn't show the problems that were, and they didn't, you know, nobody was evaluating those until afterwards. So I think there is a bit of a recognition that we need to be doing something. But yeah, you're right. I don't think there will be any. I mean, I've been involved in projects and where clients and local authorities have required an outcome performance, a particular performance of the outcome, and have set a carbon price on a discrepancy if that hasn't been made. That improvement hasn't been made. So it is possible, and you know, you just have to dig your toes in. But how it works, how it will work with the actual LADS projects that are in place at the moment, you know, is not. There's not a penalty associated with those at the moment. I think it's more about let's see if we can improve understanding. And I think the majority of projects that will go through LADS 2 particularly, you know, people will want to, they have a long-term interest in the outcomes if they can have some form of evaluation that is you know, that helps. That's where we need to be.
Thank you,
Kerry. If I can pick up, there's quite a lot of comments and stuff coming through the chat now. One specific question, Stefan's raised something which is kind of quite similar to what we've just been talking about. There is a specific question that he has though. What would happen where a tenant or resident refuses access and refuses to engage with the evaluation activity? Then a couple of other people have referred to the cost of it and how difficult it is to engage with residents once the work is done. And after that, I think that's the last question, apart from one on decent homes and whether or not you are in discussions with the review team on decent homes. So two specifics there, that if you could answer those, and then we'll move on.
Last one first. I'm not personally, but the Building Performance Network is involved in that. So people from the Building Performance Network are working with those. I'd be very pleased to talk with them directly as well, but I'm not connected in with that just at the moment. Now, the issue with residents and tenant permissions and so on, that's very, very well dealt with in the standard. So there's a lot on engagement, on there's a client a tenant engagement permission form and data form in there that's a kind of a template people can use. There's what we all know about is the potential for people to withdraw their consent and their right to be forgotten, and all of those kinds of things are in there. The standard does not require on a cohort basis. Obviously it sort of says if you're doing 10% and but you've got a survey going out to everybody, you don't need 100% response rate. You want to, for your own benefit, you want to be trying to maximize that and get great value out of it. But actually, if people don't return their surveys, then so be it. There are various ways of maximizing the opportunities for them to do so, but it's not a requirement of the standard. And then in terms of the 10%, I think we suggest in the standard that's an absolute minimum. So you might want to, if you're doing a large cohort, you might want to add one or two more in case people drop out, or you might be able to replace one with another. And in many cases, there is an opportunity if you have used your best efforts, and for some reason you aren't able to fulfill every requirement of the standard at, for example, standard level of BPE, then you've got two options. One is you can drop down to the level below and claim compliance with that, or you can explain that what has happened beyond your ability to control it, and said that's where you need to be maximizing. You can basically say, I've done what I can, I've fulfilled 95% of this, but unfortunately we were not able to do that. And so for most people they would understand that you've done your absolute utmost. So the rest of it isn't lost, and you can there are lots of things you can do about saying that the data's been captured in this way, and so on and so forth. So yeah, you can there's a recommendation in there that you explain if there's best efforts and you've for whatever reason, I mean, someone could die, all kinds of things could happen. You find that isn't a certain element can't happen.
Thanks, Kerry. There's a couple of things I think it would be really useful if we could take this offline and perhaps get a little bit of guidance. There's that minimum engagement and the collection of data that you were trying to refer to on the hoof, but I think we'll get that back out to people. There's lots of people in the chat saying that this is really useful stuff and needs to happen. People are just wanting to raise the practical problems and get some guidance on the best way forward. So an acknowledgement that it's tough to do things. I think
that's So just just to provide a tiny bit of, I hope, of reassurance, is we've had both in the comments from the consultation and the panel that put this together are people who've practically been doing this for years, or have been commissioning it and have been managing it and trying to make things happen, as well as developing tools and techniques. So all of these things have been thrashed out, and when I said there's guidance in the standard, a lot of that guidance is about how you deal with some of these practical problems, and looking at the pragmatic approach to it. Because the last thing we want to take the people with us, we don't want to put up barriers to being able to do this. So we're trying wherever we can to allow people to do as much as they can, to do it in the right way, and to be recognised for doing that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, we've occupied lots of time there. Could I suggest that we just take a 5-minute comfort break so that people can do what they need to do, and that we come back in 5 minutes, and Alan is going to pick up the next stage of this morning's session, looking at the amendments to PAS 2035. So see you all back here in 5 minutes. Thank you.
There's me, Technical Director at the Retrofit Academy, as most of you know. So I'm going to talk through the changes that have been implemented in PAS 2035 in the latest version, which was published at the end of January and is now current, and it supersedes the version we've all been working to previously, and that is formally withdrawn on the 31st of March 2022. So presumably we've got a little bit of a transition period that's just coming to an end, and it's a rather cumbersome name, PAS 2035/2030/2019 plus A1 2022, but I guess we'll just keep referring to it as the PAS going forward. But anyway, that's the formal name, and the main changes are the removal of the retrofit advisor role. So the reason for this is that the qualifications in this area were felt to be inadequate, and so it's been removed just temporarily until such time as there is a suitable qualification. And at the Retrofit Academy, we now believe there is one, in fact, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But the important point is that the advice hasn't been removed from the process. The need for advice at 3 stages is still written into the procedure, and it's just that it would be delivered by other retrofit professionals as appropriate, rather than someone with specific qualifications as a retrofit advisor. Second major change is more clarity on when a ventilation assessment is to be undertaken, which is essentially every time if there is insulation or air tightness measures. I'll talk a little bit more detail about that in a second. Explicit inclusion of air tightness as part of retrofit. So this is to recognise the fact that whenever you're insulating a building, you're also going to improve the air tightness, even if you're not actively trying to do so. So again, I trust most of us are aware of that anyway. So it's just making it explicit. And then there's also the introduction of a new term defined at the beginning of the PAS, stage by stage retrofit. So this is to allow for the fact that a whole house retrofit may not be able to proceed all in one go, and there are particular risks that need to be managed between the stages. So again, I've got another slide on this to elaborate on that a bit in a minute. So start off with retrofit assessment, and the main point here is regarding the ventilation assessment. This now comes into risk path A as well as the other risk paths. So essentially it applies regardless of the risk path for every risk path. So that hopefully is clearer. Secondly, there's reference to methodology for moisture investigations in traditional buildings. So that's information, really. It's a note, but it provides an additional source of advice for people carrying out the assessments in relation to moisture. And there's also reference to BS40101, which has recently been updated. And I think it's, I can't see my own screen because of your faces. It's Annex C in BS40101 specifically that is referenced there for that guidance. So that's something else you can potentially refer to. Retrofit design. There's some additional requirements regarding particular hazards or risks, ventilation for combustion appliances, resilience against rainwater ingress, resilience against flooding, and again, reference to another British standard for guidance on that. Fire safety, particular need to ensure that fire safety is not compromised by the work you're doing. And if necessary, you include an updated fire strategy within the design. And again, there's reference to relevant guidance, approved document B in terms of building regulations, and BS40101 in relation to fire safety strategy. And there's also a requirement for the design to include specification of any maintenance requirements that are needed to ensure the long-term integrity of the installation. So these are things that you might ideally have hoped would be included by a good designer anyway, but they're now explicitly within PAS 2035, so the retrofit coordinator can make sure that they're not forgotten. There's also specific inclusion of any repairs or maintenance required before the energy efficiency measures are installed. So that again is something that we've certainly stressed in retrofit coordinator training course, but it's now formally within the 91224 of the PAS. Two more points on design. Again, probably something you might have assumed anyway. There's clarification that if there already exists a medium-term improvement plan for a property, the retrofit coordinator will review and update that rather than creating a completely new one. And there's some additional requirements regarding measures to inhibit overheating in summer. And again, these are things that you would be aware of anyway. I think that it's beneficial to reduce internal heat loads and reduce solar gains and ensure adequate ventilation. And yes, the active cooling, it's very much considered as a last resort, and only should be considered if there's no way of using passive methods to reduce the heat loads. Stage by stage retrofit. This is defined as a retrofit process where the whole house retrofit plan is not being implemented in one go, so that's fairly straightforward. And the requirement is that the design shall include mitigation of the risks related to cold surfaces, and that's by including adequate heating and continuous ventilation or other appropriate measures. So there's flexibility in terms of how that might be achieved for the designer, but something needs to be included to recognise that risk and to mitigate the risks. There's also requirement that the measures are done in a way that doesn't inhibit the installation of other elements in due course, including details that will be needed to minimise thermal bridges. So again, very much what you might expect should be included anyway. And at each stage, the retrofit coordinator shall ensure there is a new or updated medium-term improvement plan, so that is the progress is tracked throughout the life of that medium-term plan. Retrofit advice. As I said before, this is very much still part of the process, both at the beginning of the project, at the time of the improvement option evaluation, and at handover. And all that advice is to be overseen by the retrofit coordinator. So in some cases, it may be provided by the retrofit coordinator as well, but the requirement is that the coordinator at least oversees it. And there's a specific note in relation to Path A for the retrofit advice, because there's no improvement option evaluation. There still needs to be advice on completion of the design, and that should be delivered by the designer who prepared the design or by the retrofit coordinator. So could be either. In terms of retrofit design, confirmation that a single measure under Path A In this case, the responsibility for design rests with the specialist designer for their element of the design, not with a retrofit coordinator. So the retrofit coordinator should review that design, report any concerns, but it is the responsibility of the designer to make sure that that is appropriate and correct. There's also a slight change to the requirements for the retrofit designer in the case of Path B projects on a traditionally constructed building. The designer can have the level 3 award in energy efficiency measures in traditional buildings as an alternative to being a member of the one of the building conservation schemes that are run by various organizations. So there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of the requirements for the designer in that particular case. Multiple roles, we touched on this earlier in response to a question. A person may take on 2 or more roles, provided obviously that they're suitably qualified and there's either no conflict of interest, or if there is a conflict of interest, it's reported to the client and appropriately managed. There's one exception to that, and again, this is the point I made earlier. For intermediate or advanced evaluation, the evaluator cannot be the same person as the retrofit coordinator for the project, and also must be independent of the retrofit assessor, the retrofit designer, and the retrofit installer. So obviously, intermediate and or advanced evaluation is triggered in PAS 2035 by the presence of issues arising from the project. So in that case, there's clearly going to be a conflict of interest that can't really be appropriately managed. Ventilation Annex C, there's slight change to the requirements for the retrofit design. So when installing any insulation or airtightness measure or replacing windows, the designer shall use the information provided by the retrofit assessor to assess the adequacy of the existing ventilation. So this is to clarify essentially that it's when insulation or airtightness measures are being installed rather than every dwelling proposed for improvement. So it's only where the ventilation situation would be changing. And in the temporary absence of suitable training courses, ventilation installers should be trained via a competent persons course that's available from Cert Shaw. That's an information note in the annex. Other changes, a couple of other general points. There's reference to a CEN workshop agreement, which is a methodology to support investment decision making and management of retrofit process in multi-occupancy buildings. So that's specific guidance for dealing with multi-occupancy buildings and engaging the residents in the process. And there's also a specific point that low carbon heating technologies should be considered when heating system replacement and all fabric and upgrades are carried out. So this is really to support the government policy, which is now much clearer. There's much more focus on decarbonisation since the original PAS was drafted, I think. Future changes, we've got a more comprehensive and review and update to PAS 2035 that's expected next year. So that is going to introduce more changes. One example is likely to be reference to the standard for evaluation that Kerry was talking about earlier. And so the changes that I've just described are relatively minor, mainly clarification of things that may well have been happening anyway. There's also a new standard for retrofit assessment being developed. This is going to be called BS40101. The development process has just started. I'm one of the people on the working group that's developing that standard. and we've just had one meeting and just starting to and split into working groups. So that's very much the beginning of the process. We're not entirely sure how long it will take, but the hope is that it will be in a position to be circulated. A draft will be able to be circulated for consultation this autumn, and that it should be finalised in the early part of next year. But clearly that does depend on how we go and how convoluted the discussions turn out to be around it. But the long-term objective is that will replace Section 8, I think it is, in PAS 2035, which relates to assessment, with a much more thorough guidance on the procedures that should be followed for retrofit assessments. And clearly that's important in terms of getting supporting better retrofit. On a similar theme, new qualifications. At the Retrofit Academy, we've developed a Level 4 award in domestic retrofit assessment, and that's now ready to go. We've got learners signed up to start on the course in the next few days, I believe, and this has been developed to enable people who are already qualified as domestic energy assessors to upgrade to a formal qualification in domestic retrofit assessment. So the domestic energy assessor certificate, Level 3 certificate, is a prerequisite, and so that will hopefully be a useful additional route to becoming qualified as a retrofit assessor. And in the medium term, we hope to be able to put together a further option that will enable people to go straight to a retrofit assessor without necessarily first being a domestic energy assessor. So essentially to incorporate the domestic energy assessor qualification into a retrofit assessor, a single retrofit assessor qualification. There's also a new qualification that we've developed at the Retrofit Academy, a Level 3 certificate in retrofit advice, and we hope that will fill the gap that I mentioned earlier, that's been identified in suitable qualifications for retrofit advisors. And again, that there are already people following that course. I'm not sure that anyone has finished yet, but it's a blended learning course with a mix of online learning and case studies, and it's assessed with professional discussion around a case study, as well as a series of multi-choice question tests. So that's a little bit of an overview on what's happening in the future. So I think at that point I'll stop and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Alan. We've got lots of lovely questions appearing in the chat, so we'll take them from the top. The first one came in a little while ago from Adrian Hull, and Adrian is saying, how does the retrofit coordinator retrieve the existing medium-term improvement plan if one exists and they were not the original coordinator? So this issue about retrieving the original plan, and I know helpfully Arne's put something in the chat, but welcome your view as well.
Yeah, I can't see the chat while I'm sharing the screen, so I don't know what Arne has said. I'm sure it will be helpful, but my understanding is at the moment it's not possible to retrieve that medium-term improvement plan, and this is an issue that Trustmark need to resolve, and I'm afraid I have no idea what sort of timescale that might be resolved on, but it's clearly an IT issue.
Thank you. Arne's indicating he might be able to give a little bit more.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so I spoke to Trustmark about this, and I think that the most we can say is the direction of travel is to amend that. So the current improvements to the way that Trustmark works are really driven around requirements and additions for Eco 4. So things that are being done for Eco 4 should take the way Trustmark works forward. I'm not sure there is a timeline for when that increased functionality will be in place. So it may be that it happens sort of this year. It may be that that's not what happens at all. So there is no official line about timelines, only that the direction of travel was upgrades for Eco 4 would lead into, or the intent was that they would lead into that higher level of functionality.
Thank you, Arne. Next question is from Carl Harvey. Can the retrofit coordinator still be the retrofit designer on a Path B project, Alan?
Yes, if they're suitably qualified.
There you go. How easy was that? Thank you very much. Next one is kind of a comment stroke question from Kath Manning. Although removing the requirement for ventilation, unless you're going to change air tightness, will bring down costs, she's concerned that there might be a missed opportunity, as it was a good mechanism for improving ventilation, which may be inadequate. Any further comment on that, Alan?
No, I couldn't argue with that. That's a very good point. Yeah, I think it's yeah, in some ways it's a slight step back in terms of the rigor of what we're doing, but I think it was yeah, there was obviously a lot of feedback that it didn't seem reasonable to require it when you were when it was a single measure project that wasn't going to affect the air tightness.
Thank you. Matthew Elliott says, and I think you may have covered some of that in your presentation after he asked the question, will currently qualified DEAs with a retrofit assessor training course need to go back and get the new qualifications?
They won't have to go back and get the one that we've just launched, at least not in the short term, because they are, if they've carried out the upgrade training required by the various accreditation bodies, whichever one they're a member of, they are accredited, and there's no proposal that would need to be replaced by a formal qualification at this point. That might perhaps change when we have the new standard for retrofit assessment, depending on what that requires. But that's a discussion that's still to be had, a debate that's still to be had.
Thank you. Kerry's put a question in to say that it was previously recognised that the retrofit assessment standard has some overlap, common elements with BS40101. How can we ensure that that's taken account of during the development of that standard?
Well, I've got greater awareness of that following Kerry's presentation this morning, so I've made a mental note that I need to factor that into to what I'm thinking about. I'm specifically chairing the working group on occupancy, so there's a crossover with that at least, and I will certainly undertake to bring it to the attention of the rest of the group when we next meet. Thank you.
The next in the chat is just a comment from Kate Charrington, which I think is worthy of just sharing with the folks who can't see it. So Kate delivered the training for the first level 3 certificate in retrofit advice. You were saying you didn't know whether anybody had actually graduated. There have been 12 graduates so far, so that's great news. And then there's another question about how do we sign people up to that new course? And I'll ask my colleagues, either Andy or Emily, to make sure that we make this available to people either in the chat here now or after the session when we issue the recording information, so that people can sign up to both of the level 3 and level 4 new qualifications that are available. We have a question from Lorraine. Are the new qualifications in recognition that the additional 10 hours CPD offered by accreditation companies is not sufficient?
Yes, I guess so. Although certainly, yeah, there are concerns that those courses were sufficient, were relatively brief, and the whole purpose of PAS 2035 is to bring the standard of retrofit assessment up, and so a formal qualification which requires a little bit more in terms of testing competence, as opposed to just online learning, is hopefully going to achieve that. So the level 4 qualification we've developed, it does include the requirement to actually carry out 2 retrofit assessments for assessment for the qualification, and the professional discussion around one of them with the assessor. So there's it's covering competence as well as knowledge.
Thank you. The next question we have is from Cornelius, who offers the training for the level 3 energy efficiency measures for older and traditional buildings? One dear to your heart, maybe, Alan.
Well,
and can an RC still sign off pathway B while doing the training? So 2 questions there.
Yes, I mean, there are organisations offering that training already. I personally am developing a course, but hopefully we'll be ready in about a month's time, so that we'll be offering that as well in the near future. So, sorry, what was the second part again?
The second question was, can a retrofit coordinator still sign off pathway B whilst doing the training?
I wouldn't have thought so. It's a relatively short course. It's only it's a 3-day course, so it's relatively quick to get once you embark on it. So it's not as if it's like a like the retrofit coordinator course, which takes most people 3 or 4 months, if not more, to get through while they're getting qualified. So I wouldn't have thought there's a reason to allow that. It's certainly not specifically written into the PAS that it's allowed.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Noel, which I think you've covered. Good to hear the DEA qualification and retrofit assessor course will be combined. When will that be launched? I think you said any time now, and we can provide some.
Having done the first course, it was much quicker to develop a course that built onto the existing domestic energy assessor qualification. But having said that, there's nothing new in the domestic energy assessor qualification that needs to be brought in. So I don't think it should take very long, but I can't state a particular date. There's no project plan that I can base any estimate on, really, but certainly the near future, so yeah, it inevitably takes a bit of time because you've got to deal with the awarding body as well, get the criteria agreed and so on. So,
and Emily has helpfully just put in the chat that the level 3 retrofit advisor and the level 4 retrofit assessor course are currently available, only available through our funded projects in Essex, Devon and Manchester. If you're eligible, that would be a fully funded place, and she's put the link in the chat for you, so please check that out. We've got another question here from John Abbott. On occupant, is there any allowance for people that just use room thermostats rather than having the heating on and off, and will that be addressed?
Sorry, can I?
John, if you're there, do you want to elaborate on that question?
Yeah, in the heating, there's no, most people that we come across, they don't set their heating to come on at a specific time and go off at a time. They just use the room thermostat at a temperature, and there's no way we can put that in on the assessment. So it doesn't really give an accurate picture of how people are using their heating at all.
I see what you mean. That is something that will come into it's one of the things we've been talking about for the occupancy assessment as part of the new standard for assessment. One of the aspects clearly is the information that we collect for occupants regarding how they use their controls, and so that is definitely an issue that will be picked up there as part of the retrofit assessment, and so that will then potentially be able to be fed into the SAP calculations that are used for the improvement option evaluation.
Thank you, Alan. And the final question before we flick on to the final part of the session, which Arnaut is going to take us through. So the last question from Dean is the retrofit advisor going to be a mandatory requirement in future PASs. Would I be correct in saying that many advisors would be the assessor also?
Yeah, my understanding is that, well, certainly we would hope that the qualification we've developed for retrofit advisor will be deemed, everyone will agree that that fills the gap, and that therefore it will go back into the next update of the PAS as a requirement for retrofit advisors in delivering to PAS standard. So so yes, it may well be mandatory requirement, or there may be alternatives. There may be other qualifications developed that might also be deemed appropriate. You might well be correct that the advisors may also be the assessor. As I said before, regarding multiple roles, there's no reason why one person can't take on more than one role. The PAS takes the approach of defining the roles specifically, and if you had the qualifications to do both roles, then there's no reason why you wouldn't do both roles. There's clearly a potential benefit in combining the two in one visit, particularly if it's face-to-face advice in the home, which is the most effective way to deliver advice.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another question, which is around how can you get on Retrofit Academy courses if you're not in a CRF or the fully funded area? And we'll get some information out to you, Lisa, and others on that later. Okay, thank you. Thanks for all those great questions. Arn, last but very not least, would you like to pick up the slide deck and take us through what's up next?
Okay, I'm just pressing my share screen buttons now. Hopefully we'll get to the right place. Hopefully that's working.
Yeah.
Looks like it is.
Super. I can't now see the time, so I will try to be brief because we like to finish on time. And I was just doing a sort of two things. One, a taster for what we intend to do in the next summit in May, and also to create an opportunity for you, the audience, to feed into our thinking. And to some degree, the second part is probably the more important. So I'll kind of do the taster, but the real reason for the taster is to get you to think about how you might like us to shape that. So if you just pile in any thoughts as we go along about what you would like out of that session as I do this, put them in the chat and we will think through those, or contact us if you've got a really strong thought about anything. So the main focus of the next summit is around the Midlands Energy Hub toolkit that we produced. That toolkit was created primarily for local authorities delivering LADS type projects. However, it is applicable to any project. And part of the reason why we're asking for input is that some of this relates to that relationship between the funding client and, for example, the retrofit coordinator. There are other elements, but it's that relationship and how you try and make that with aligned expectations. So what they, the clients, think you, the retrofit coordinator, are doing, and vice versa, are the same. And that hopefully will lead to better, smoother projects as we progress. So the toolkit, I might stretch the analogy here, but bear with me. So the toolkit has 4 parts, and we always like to describe these as very different tools. So mine is part B, the management considerations, which I'll mention briefly as we go forwards to explain what they are. That's something of a lump hammer. It's unrefined, unsophisticated, very simple tool, very good at the job it does. If you need something bashing, you want a lump hammer. The customer journey is perhaps more of an electrical screwdriver. It's much more refined. It does a much more detailed, delicate job. They're different tools for different things. So those 4 parts, the customer journey is all about the resident client, the person in the house. Who does what, where, when, how, what should they do, what shouldn't they do? Lots of detail on that piece. I'll talk about the management consideration, but essentially this is about making PAS work for you. and trying to make PAS work for you in the easiest way. The legal protocol, slightly simplistically, is some legal boilerplate stuff you can take and use to build into contracts to try and make sure that some of those things in PAS are highlighted to the people you are contracting to perform those roles. And the specifications is exactly what it suggests. So there are half a dozen, maybe 15 or 20. I didn't write them. Specific specifications, for example, for loft insulation. So lots of detail there, which again you might want to use. So our intent was to cover all these elements within the next session. There is an ongoing conversation about whether they should be sequential or concurrent. So it may be that we kind of have 4 separate rooms and we break out and do that. So feedback from you guys about whether or not you really want to be in all of them and you'd rather have 4 short sessions, or whether or not you really want to only want to dive into Sally's customer journey, and so you'd rather have more depth on each, would be useful as we think about how that works. So part B, let's just talk about part B as an illustration, because that's my bit that I will do, and hopefully talking about that as an illustration will help you think about those questions we're asking in terms of your input. So the basic explanation of part B, the management considerations and touch points, is it is intended to give clients a way to dip into all the things that are supposed to be happening in PAS, so they can do a kind of light touch quality assurance check. So without knowing or understanding half of PAS, you can still use what PAS is supposed to create to make it work for you. Dip into some of those key parts of PAS, check that what should be there is there, and therefore have confidence that maybe all the parts are there, and maybe the ones where the least input has the highest impact are the ones where you are pressing the buttons to see what's going on. There's then a second part to this, which is about understanding the depth of what PAS roles are, what the words in PAS mean, and particularly some of the grey areas for interpretation. So I'm doing another presentation today. I'm talking about the cost of a retrofit coordinator and whether or not it's 85 quid or 850 quid. I'm quoting those numbers because I've heard both, and it's possible that the reason why those two kind of crazy different numbers exist is about, partly at least, about different people having a different interpretation about exactly what some of the words in PAS mean. So that was more sexy than I was anticipating. PAS, I think, is 184 pages if you include PAS 2030, which you should, because it's easiest to think about it as a chapter in PAS. Furthermore, it's hard to read. And furthermore, when you read PAS, you then have to go and read other standards, because parts of PAS just say, do this in accordance with that. So in order to fully understand PAS, you have to read PAS 2035, PAS 2030, half a dozen or a dozen other standards, your thousands of pages. That's a lot of depth. For that reason, the Retrofit Academy created the compliance process map. This exists as a written document and as Excel software. And essentially, this gives you 217 line items of things you should do as the assessor, coordinator, and designer. If you've done all those 217 line items, you're probably doing what you need to do to comply with PAS. Again, all well and good, makes it nice and clear, works really well if you are an advisor, an assessor, a coordinator, or a designer, because it gives you a checklist. But for lots of those funding clients, this is more depth than they need, or more micromanagement than they want to apply. So we created a set of touch points, which is what part B of the toolkit is, to try and simplify this a little bit further. So quick look at those. So in the touch points, there are 20, 22, depending how you count, lines that you might look at. The ones in bold, or at least in green in bold, take that 20, 22 down to half a dozen really important things. And on the right, I've taken that half a dozen things and come back down to 3 absolute bare bones. If you're only going to do them the least in terms of looking at how PAS is being delivered in your project, these are the ones I think you should pick out. I'm currently working my way around the Retrofit Academy, seeing if other people share my view about what to look at first. So far, so good, but it's not necessarily a universal thing. And this doesn't matter. You can pick the ones you like. And we'll look at these just because it helps to illustrate it. So item 1 in the contract, make sure you write that people have to do everything in accordance with PAS, and make sure that the contract documents say which roles sit where. Then effectively all the detail in PAS is already incorporated into your contract, so everybody should know what they're doing. If in the contracting process it doesn't clarify who the retrofit designer is, then it's possible for everybody to think it's somebody else. And then that's when you're in trouble before you started, because when you go back and unpick that, you're then adding a designer, adding all sorts of contractual pain, adding all sorts of costs. The other 2 things I picked out were, in the design, check that the construction details exist. And then in the install process, somebody check that the details that have been drawn are the ones being built. And these, I think, are key elements. And also they represent those slightly grey areas that we talked about. So if we take the install, check the details are being built. Is the retrofit coordinator going to do that? Are they going to site? Are they ever leaving their office? When they get to the site, what are they doing? These things are not crystal clear in terms of what the words in PAS say. So, I'm getting an echo. So it's really important that people understand what the roles have to do in PAS, what you might want them to do, and therefore how you contract to make sure that the grey areas are clear. So I've only briefly sort of dipped into this because this is the content of my part of part B that I will do at the next summit. So hopefully there's one more. We're very keen to hear from you about whether or not you want the 4 sections. Possibly, actually, we split by audience, and we have people like retrofit coordinators in one group and people like social housing provider funding clients in another, because there are slightly different perspectives. Again, your view will help to feed into how that comes together. This might be about emphasis. So, for example, it might be about going through those touch points in detail, looking at the issues, looking at how those things fit. The one I just picked there in terms of looking at the design, there's a narrative section that goes with those touch points. That's my favorite. So it's 3 pages long in that section. Whether or not that stuff is what you want to see, or how the contract structures work, those roles, anything that you wish to throw into the chat would be great, and we'll use that as we think about just how to put this together. And that's the end of my bit, hopefully on time.
You are on time, Arn. That's really brilliant. And clearly Arn's very passionate about part B, whereas I'm very passionate about part A, because I wrote that because it's all about customers, which is my particular passion. So we've had a couple of comments in the chat saying I want to know all about it, and the suggestion that perhaps we have a general overview of each part so everybody understands a little more of each part, and then we do deep dives or particular focus thereafter. We'd be more than happy to take feedback. You can get in touch with us any way you like. You can pop it on LinkedIn, you can email Emily and Andy, which I know lots of you are already connected into doing. You can keep putting stuff into the chat. You can email any of us. So really interested to hear your views. I have noticed that since Emily put the toolkit into the chat just a few minutes ago, because I get a link, get a notification every time somebody downloads. We've had 15 downloads in less than 15 minutes. And we've had a comment from Fallon, thank you very much, Fallon, to say she's already downloaded it. They're already starting to use it at Orbit on their projects, particularly in terms of thinking about how to work out their supply chain needs, how to engage with them. So that's a bit of good feedback. Thank you very much, Fallon. I will give one last chance for anybody to ask a question of anybody or pop anything in the chat. We're just a minute over time. So anybody got anything finally that they want to say or ask?
Sally, this is Clive from Retrofit Academy. Carl raised a question about the U values, and particularly the U values that were stated within the toolkit when he was talking about flat roof. It was one of the questions that was raised up there. I just had a look into the details, and it actually comes from Appendix D of the new version of approved document L. and covering the minimum requirements when you're talking about building a house with a heat pump. So that's the information that probably you're after, Carl.
Thank you very much, Clive. I'd actually missed that question, so thank you for being so on the ball, and hopefully that answers your question, Carl. If not, please come back to us.
Can I just check these new changes to PAS 2035 that Alan's talked about? Are these already in force, so to speak? So if we've got a current project, do we need to be making sure they're included? Thank you.
I believe so. There's no formal transition arrangements other than what I stated at the beginning, that the previous PAS is being withdrawn from 31st of March. So there's no ambiguity beyond tomorrow, I would suggest. For a couple of months, we've had both formally available, but I think I would assume that you need to follow the new PAS. The changes aren't that dramatic anyway, as I said more than once. I think that mostly they're things that we would have suggested people would be doing anyway. So I don't see that can be too much for pain for people.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed hearing from Kerry and Alan and Arn, and we've obviously had some great questions. I hope you've had some answers to your questions this morning. If I could ask the presenters and the Retrofit Academy staff to stay on the call, I'll say goodbye to the rest of you. I hope you have a great day and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Bye-bye.